The sky was a perfect cloudless blue, a shade of azure so pure it felt like a lie. That was the first thing everyone remembered. That and the silence of a normal Tuesday morning shattered by the scream of an engine at full throttle. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 loaded with 20,000 gallons of jet fuel, did not request permission to land. It simply turned, descended, and vanished into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. For a breathtaking, horrifying moment, the world held its breath, believing it had witnessed a catastrophic accident. But 17 minutes later, as news cameras focused on the burning gash in the tower's steel skin, United Airlines Flight 175 streaked into the South Tower. And in that fireball, America's innocence evaporated. This was not an accident. It was an announcement. The architect of this terror was not a specter, but a man of flesh and bone, a skeletal figure on a dialysis machine with the unwavering eyes of a fanatic. Osama bin Laden, the scion of a billionaire Saudi construction family, had traded a life of privilege for a cave, morphing into the emir of Al-Qaeda, the base. To him, the modern world was a blasphemy, and the United States, the Great Satan, was its chief promoter. His right hand was a man known for his strategic brilliance and cold-blooded efficiency, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the self-proclaimed mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. KSM, as he would become known to intelligence agencies, was the engineer of the plot, the one who first pitched the idea of using planes as missiles to a skeptical bin Laden. These were not madmen in the traditional sense. They were tacticians, patient and meticulous, their hatred forged in the crucible of geopolitical conflict and a twisted interpretation of their faith. They saw the world not in nations, but in believers and infidels, and they were ready to write their manifesto in fire and blood. Their weapon was not a bomb, but a group of men, 19 hijackers, mostly from Saudi Arabia, who had embedded themselves in the fabric of American life. They took flight lessons, they worked out at gyms, they lived in quiet suburban apartments. Mohammed Atta, the brooding, intense Egyptian who would pilot Flight 11 into the North Tower, was the field commander. He was a man consumed by his mission, so much so that he left behind a detailed 5-page manual for his fellow hijackers. It instructed them on everything from spiritual preparation to the final, brutal mechanics of the takeover. Shout Allahu Akbar, because this strikes fear in the hearts of the non-believers, he wrote. Check your weapons, your knives, your will. These were not soldiers, they were assassins hiding in plain sight, their fanaticism a cold, hard secret beneath the surface of everyday life. The morning of September 11th, 2001, began with the mundane rituals of a nation going to work. In Boston, the hijackers passed through security checkpoints, their box cutters and pepper spray somehow evading detection. At the windows on the World Restaurant atop the North Tower, waiters prepared for the lunch rush. In the South Tower, brokers at Cantor Fitzgerald settled in at their desks. And in the skies above, the 4 planes, American 11, United 175, American 77, and United 93, became their own contained universes of horror. On Flight 11, a flight attendant managed to call a ground manager. "We are in the cockpit. The plane is erratic. I think we're being hijacked." Then, a voice believed to be Atta's, transmitting to the passengers by mistake. "Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any moves, you'll endanger yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet." The line went dead. The world watched the second plane hit the South Tower on live television, a moment that transformed confusion into certifiable nightmare. But the horror was still unfolding, its scope expanding. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, piloted by hijacker Hani Hanjour, a man who had struggled with basic flight maneuvers just months before, executed a steep, spiraling descent and slammed into the western face of the Pentagon. A pillar of American military might was now burning, its 5 sides breached, the lives inside extinguished in an instant. The attacks were not confined to New York. The nation's capital was under assault. In a bunker beneath the White House, Vice President Dick Cheney relayed a harrowing order to fighter pilots scrambled to defend the Capitol. They were authorized to shoot down any commercial airliner that refused to divert. America was at war with ghosts in its own skies. The fourth act of the drama played out not over a city, but over a field in Pennsylvania. United Flight 93 had taken off from Newark, delayed by just over 25 minutes. That delay was everything. By the time the hijackers took control, the passengers and crew, using their airphones, had learned the fate of the other 3 planes. They knew this was a suicide mission. They knew they were not going to land. A vote was taken. A decision was made. Todd Beamer, a 32-year-old account manager, was heard by a GTE operator saying, "Are you guys ready? Let's roll." The sounds that followed were a chaotic symphony of struggle. Screams, shouts, and the shattering of dishes as the passengers used a food cart as a battering ram against the cockpit door. The plane, meant for the U.S. Capitol or the White House, began to pitch and roll violently before plunging nose first into an empty field in Shanksville at 563 miles per hour. "Let's roll," a phrase of mundane American action, became a final, defiant battle cry. The first counterattack in the new war had been launched by civilians. Back in Lower Manhattan, the unthinkable was becoming reality. The impact of the jets and the infernos that followed had critically compromised the structural integrity of the Twin Towers. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower, its spine severed, buckled and collapsed in a terrifying rolling cloud of dust and debris. 29 minutes later, the North Tower followed. The iconic symbols of American economic power were reduced to a smoldering 6-story-high pile of rubble and human remains. The dust cloud, a tsunami of pulverized concrete, glass, and steel, chased people through the canyons of the city, swallowing them whole. The air was thick with the smell of burning plastic, jet fuel, and death. In the hours and days that followed, the investigation began not as a whodunit, but as a rescue operation. Firefighters, police, and first responders dug with their hands, hoping for miracles, finding only tragedy. The final death toll would be 2,177 people from over 90 nations murdered in a single morning. The FBI's investigation, dubbed Pent Bomb, was the largest in its history. It moved with breathtaking speed. Within hours, thanks to passenger manifests and quick work by airport officials, the names of the hijackers were known. Their identities led back to Al-Qaeda. In the wreckage of the towers, investigators found a miracle. The passport of one of the hijackers, Satam al-Suqami, singed but intact, a tiny, inexplicable piece of evidence that had survived the inferno. The digital trail was just as damning. Khalid, Sheikh Mohammed's nephew, Ramzi Youssef, had been convicted for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. The connections were clear. This was an evolution of a long-standing war. The evidence pointed unequivocally to Osama bin Laden, hiding in the mountains of Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban regime. The demand from the United States was simple and non-negotiable: hand over bin Laden or share his fate. The Taliban refused. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the first U.S. airstrikes hit Taliban positions in Afghanistan. The war on terror had begun. For a decade, the hunt for the mastermind was the world's most relentless manhunt. The trail led through the shadows of Pakistan's tribal regions, fueled by intelligence, bounties, and the unwavering memory of that September day. The climax did not arrive in a courtroom, but in a walled compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. For years, the CIA had been tracking a man they called the Pacer, a tall, reclusive figure who never left the compound's walls. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. On May 2, 2011, 2 stealth Black Hawk helicopters carrying U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 crossed the border into Pakistani airspace. The mission, codenamed Operation Neptune Spear, was as audacious as the plot it sought to avenge. The helicopters descended on the compound. One made a hard landing, but the team pressed on. They breached the walls, clearing the guest house before moving to the main building. On the third floor, they found their target. Osama bin Laden was shot and killed in a short, violent firefight. His body was identified, then buried at sea within 24 hours, a final, deliberate act to ensure no shrine would ever be built. The courtroom drama for the other architects of 9/11 is one that is still, 2 decades later, mired in legal purgatory. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was captured in a raid in Pakistan in 2003. He was waterboarded 183 times during his interrogation by the CIA, a fact that would forever taint the evidence he provided. He and 4 co-conspirators were transferred to the U.S. detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, where they remain, their military tribunal proceedings plagued by delays, allegations of torture, and legal wrangling over what constitutes admissible evidence. KSM himself has openly boasted of his role, telling the tribunal, "I was responsible for the 9/11 operation from A to Z." For the families of the victims, this endless legal limbo is a second, protracted torture, a constant reminder that while the architect is dead, the blueprint of his evil remains on trial, with final justice perpetually out of reach. The shockwaves of that single day never truly subsided. They simply became the new normal, the hum of a permanently altered world. They are in the long, slow-motion tragedy of the first responders dying from cancers and respiratory diseases linked to the toxic dust. They are in the sprawling post-9/11 security apparatus, the TSA, the Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, that reshaped the contract between citizen and state. They are in the 2 decades of war that followed, conflicts that cost trillions of dollars and countless more lives. The attacks were not just a crime, they were a geopolitical earthquake, the fault lines of which are still shifting. The world was fractured into a before and an after, and the memory of that perfect blue sky is now forever stained with black smoke and the falling dust of 3,000 souls. The legacy of 9/11 is not just written in the history books or etched into the memorials, it is carried in the silent, unanswerable questions of a generation that learned in one morning that the world's greatest power was also profoundly vulnerable. It is the story of a perfect day weaponized of ordinary people on a plane over Pennsylvania who looked into the abyss and chose to fight back, and of a nation that learned that the price of freedom is a vigilance that never, ever ends. It is a reminder that the most dangerous threats are not always armies, but ideas, carried by men willing to trade their lives for a spectacle of terror. And in the quiet of a remembered Tuesday, a single, chilling truth remains. The world we built to keep us safe vanished with the falling of the towers. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.